Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of our webinar series, Inside Immigration. Today with the theme, Canada-US 2024, Business Across the Border. Today we are joined by panelists, Cristina, Guida, and Benjamin Green. Please feel free to ask any questions via the questions icon at the top of your screen, and we will do our best to address them at the end. If the panelists do not get to your question, you can contact them through the information provided on the screen right now. And with that being said, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cristina Guida, and I'm joined here by Benjamin Green. So as we indicated, we're going to be taking you through some of the updates with respect to U.S. and Canadian immigration. We're going to set you off with the landscape in the U.S. and take you through some of the options that we have here in Canada that can help you plan things over the next year. We're taking this as a planning episode, so just to give you an idea of what to do and how to get things going in 2024. So with that said, I will pass things on to Benjamin, who will take us through the U.S. immigration system.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Really what we're looking at today is, as Cristina mentioned, planning around the H-1B lottery, an extremely important time in U.S. immigration. And how you and your companies can support your businesses through that difficult time. In a bit of an understatement, the H-1B lottery odds are very long. For those looking to use it to retain talent or bring in talent, it's a really unpredictable way to acquire work authorization for your employees. Last year set records in both how many entrants went into the lottery and how poor the odds were. Nearly 800,000 persons were entered into the H-1B lottery to secure that work visa in the United States, and less than 150,000 were granted. So you're looking at roughly 1 in 8 odds of securing work authorization for your talent. Now, that obviously is not odds that you can work with, that your businesses can plan on, and that you can run a functional business with. Now, I've had some colleagues say to me, well, we've got TNs as an alternative for our Mexican and Canadian nationals. And that is sometimes a viable option for your talent who can't get in on the lottery. But we're also seeing significant scrutiny on TNs at this time related to the lottery. And what happens at USCIS and CBP is they're saying to themselves, well, people know how tough the lottery is. People know that the odds are long. So why don't we just try for a TN? And they've instructed their officers, both at visa centers and at the border, to be doubly sort of difficult and be under greater scrutiny, because they know that people are trying to avoid the lottery, and they know that weaker TNs are coming through at this time. And where does that put us, and where does that put your businesses? Is in a tough situation, right? You've had employees, some of which may have joined you when they were postgrads coming out of US universities. Some may be working at foreign affiliates looking to move to North America. And you're caught between rigid rules and this talent that you kind of invested 1, 2, 3, as many as 4 or 5 years in. So we've got a problem. The US system is such that while it provides great opportunity to many, getting their foot in the door from a work authorization perspective is quite difficult. What do? I found in my personal practice that Canada is an excellent option in the short, medium, and long term for these employees who can't get that foothold in the United States. And using Canada as an alternative for these employees, whether they've been working with you already or they're potential new hires, can be a great option for, first of all, getting them sort of consistent with a time zone. If you've got an office in California, bringing somebody to British Columbia allows you to work in a much more fluid manner. And on top of that, and as Cristina will touch on, lots of different ways to bring them here in the medium term, and then in the long term, potentially with regard to permanent residence. But to sort of continue the theme here, that requires a lot of careful planning. And with that, I'll sort of pass it off to Cristina, who can speak to the different methods that we can use to bring your talent to Canada, to support them, to keep them doing the best work they can.
Thanks, Benjamin. So just so we kind of have the landscape in place, when does this lottery happen in the US?
Sure. So the H-1B lottery happens once a year. And as I mentioned, it's the most popular way to get a work visa in the United States. Year over year, it sees the most entrants. And indeed, when you look at the breakdown of visas in the United States giving work authorization, it's the most popular. It happens once a year, April 1st. And you'll know the results of it if you put your candidates in, you know the results within a week. So to the extent there are no surprises that the lottery is coming, the only surprise really is your result. And with some slight sort of variations for education, it really is a true lottery. There's very little employers can do to weigh it in favor of their star talent who they can't be without. They are victims to this true lottery. On top of that, just because you win the lottery doesn't mean you get the visa, and it doesn't mean it happens immediately. There are lots of compliance issues that can happen in between a successful entrant and not. And on top of that, the lottery happens in April, but the visa only kicks in October. So many people think, oh, I've won the lottery. I've been living in the United Kingdom. I can move tomorrow. Far from the case.
Yes, and that helps us understand why planning now in January, or we're in February now, the month has really passed us, why it's important to have these discussions. And this is usually the time of year where companies say to us, especially with the odds of last year, the conversation about what options do we have in Canada has really picked up, because the reality is, as Benjamin indicated, the odds are not in employers' favors and in applicants' favors, unfortunately. So Canada is seen as the alternative, and we're happy to have companies open up in Canada and have workers come up here. So, you know, April 1st, I love the selection of the date. It's, you know, not to coincide with April Fool's Day, but it happens to be that day as well. But April 1st, the day after, we have constant calls, right? Okay, we didn't get selected. We don't know what to do. We have this great candidate. We don't want to lose them. Cristina, what are the options? So what we have been advising clients to do is, in the long term, because really we work with a lot of cross-border clients, is let's establish a business in Canada, be it a subsidiary, a affiliate, some sort of connection to your US operation. If that's opened up in Canada and the applicant has been working for you for 1 year in a senior position, a senior manager, executive, or a specialized knowledge position, let's bring them up to Canada. Okay, so that's the easiest way. So the way we triage these is, has the person been working for you for 1 year? Great. Is it in a senior position, managerial position, specialized knowledge position? Great. Then let's establish that operation in Canada and let's transfer them as an intracompany transferee. So when we're doing these transfers up to Canada as an intracompany transferee, the operation in Canada has to be doing business. Okay, so that's the key indicator here. A lot of our clients will set people up as an employer of record, or they're not really doing business in Canada. They have to have an established. So what's doing business look like? It's, you know, you've established the business, there's a CRA number involved, there's payroll, there's people. It's actually operational. So for all intents and purposes, the government recognizes it as an operation in Canada. By transferring these individuals up to Canada, it then allows them to work in Canada. Usually, if it's a new establishment, it's for 1 year, and then they'll get a 1 year work permit, and then it can be renewed up to 5 to 7 years, depending on the position. So if it's an executive position, it can continue to be renewed up to 7 years, usually at 2 to 3 year intervals. And then if it's a specialized knowledge position, it's to a maximum of 5 years, again, at 2 to 3 year intervals. But if it's a new business in Canada, you don't have that operation in Canada, the initial work permit is for 1 year and then can be extended after that. If you already have an affiliate, a subsidiary of some sort up in Canada, that's great. You can then transfer them up to Canada and continue to work. A lot of the a lot of the issues that we encounter is that period of time between when their authorization in the US expires and the processing times for the visa for Canada. Okay, so that's usually where we're playing against the clock, and we always have a ticking, there's always a ticker on in the background. So the key thing here is identifying the talent that you have that is coming up on expiration, or you don't have a clear plan in terms of what's going to be happening in the US, identifying those candidates now, and then doing an assessment as to whether we can bring them up to Canada in some capacity. Because what happens is if their authorization in the US expires, processing times for the Canadian visa post are longer than usual, then we're left in a bit of a conundrum. Okay, that again is if the candidate is from a visa required country. So typical visa required countries that we deal with are, people from India, from China, African countries. We have a lot of people coming from Argentina, places like that. They require visas, so they have to get authorization at the visa post prior to traveling to Canada. If you have a candidate that is from a visa exempt country, so that's usually people from Europe, Australia, places like that, they can come to the border and ask for the work permit. So that's when we're doing the intercompany transfer. So the key here is planning, and that's why we thought today's session was going to be so important, because it's about identifying those candidates straight away. Now, that's the solution for someone who has been working for you for 1 year or longer at the US entity. If they have not been working for you for 1 year or longer, then we have to look at different avenues in terms of getting a work permit. So the key way, secondary to the labor market impact assessment, the way we approach things at Green and Spiegel is we do an assessment. The labor market, the LMIA, the labor market impact assessment, is essentially the last option if we can use something else. If the candidate doesn't qualify under ICT, then we can look at the free trade agreements, and perhaps they come from a country where Canada has negotiated a free trade agreement and that specific occupation was on that list, then we'll explore that. If it's a French-speaking candidate, even better, because we have a fantastic work permit category under the Francophone mobility program. So Canada is really encouraging French as a second language in places other than Quebec. So that might also be a good place in terms of where you're looking to recruit candidates. If you're looking abroad and bringing them into the US or even into Canada, looking at French-speaking countries may benefit you as well as a plan B for Canada. Okay, so keep that in mind. Perhaps your company is large enough that you have a global mobility policy. We can also look at other work permits under the reciprocal, where essentially there is, as a result of you having a global mobility policy and just having a global presence, if there are Canadians or permanent residents that have been transferred abroad, Canada allows reciprocal opportunities for foreign workers to come into Canada. So that's also something else to consider. If none of these options work, then we go to our beloved LMIA application. So the LMIA application is, and you'll often hear it referred to as an LMIA. It's really a market certification. The government officials will look at it and say, okay, have you tested the labor market? Is there a Canadian or permanent resident that can fill the position that you're offering? If there isn't, then you can offer the position to a foreign worker. So that being your US employee. Now, there's two avenues under the LMIA program. There's the regular LMIA, where you would advertise the position for 4 weeks, recruit, try and find a Canadian or permanent resident. If you can't find them, you can offer the foreign worker the position. You get that positive LMIA, or that positive market certification. And with that certification, you then apply for the work permit. But Canada has implemented, and what we find the most success with, especially in our clients in the IT industry, is using the second LMIA option, which is the global talent stream, where essentially the government has carved out a set of occupations where they say you don't have to test the labor market and advertise for 4 weeks. Instead, you can use this global talent stream known as GTS. And with that, you will include, if the occupation is on the list, and it's usually IT related occupations, then you can bypass the advertising, and you can do something that's called a labor market benefit plan. So it's very similar in its spirit to the advertising, but it's essentially saying that the Canadian employer is going to commit to increasing the skills and training of the Canadian workforce. So essentially saying there's a particular skill set that this foreign worker has that we want to be able to transfer to the Canadian labor market. So how do we do that? We're going to set up training that the foreign worker is going to be part of. We're going to offer, different incentives. You're going to implement, participation of unrepresented groups or maybe students, that kind of stuff. The idea is that the foreign worker is going to transfer their skills to the Canadian labor market. So this is a fantastic way of getting a lot of your talent, especially in the IT industries, up to Canada, because you don't have to worry about 1 year, and you don't have to 1 year when I was referring to the ICT startups, but then also you don't have to worry about recruitment. So it's a fairly quick process. And we find this to be the most beneficial and the fastest way if we can't use any of the other examples that we've talked about. So again, this requires training, it requires planning. Okay, we're going to have to be able to look at, what the company can commit to, what the foreign workers look like, just what your business is all about, and if we can take that. Now, Benjamin, feel free to provide your feedback if there's anything that I've missed out on. But essentially, these are the big areas to get people to start working in Canada. The idea here is that they're working in Canada, trying to maybe figure out other options in the US if they want to return to the US, if they've applied for a green card in some capacity, or, well, actually, Benjamin, you can speak to that and how that plays out a bit as well, maybe when I'm done. And then, or also just, taking another stab at the lottery in the following year, whatever the case may be, they can come into Canada. But, and again, Benjamin will speak to that a bit later, but what we find is most people want to just transition to permanent residence, really. So the idea is you come to Canada, you've worked for a year, and you can apply for Canadian permanent residency through the Canadian Experience Class. Most of your talent will likely be highly educated, speak English well. If any of the candidates are over the age of 45, it kind of puts them in a tricky situation because the express entry system is a points-based system. And unfortunately, from the age of 30 onwards and to the age of 46, you no longer get points. So as an example, if you're 29 and younger, you're getting 120 points for your age. And then every year you lose about 5 or 10 points. And then once you hit 45, you get no points for age. So that just kind of puts it in context also. As an idea of identifying the talent that you want to bring into Canada or finding long-term solutions. So Canada offers a lot of opportunities. There is, anyone following the news, Canada is making some changes with respect to immigration and how things are being done, but in the long run, it's still a great opportunity for your talent to come up to Canada and different options available to them. So what we can do at Green and Spiegel is help you plan. We can sit with you and figure out what your business needs, and with the help of our US side and our Canadian side, we can come up with a really great plan. So Benjamin, did you want to talk a bit about,
Just, I think that's the one thing we're trying to get across today, right? Is the time to plan is now. When the lottery happens, April 1st is not a surprise. Your talent and their work authorization and when they're going to expire, also not a surprise if you're completing your I-9s properly. So what we're saying is when you're having these discussions with your employees and preparing to put them in the lottery, saying to them, hey, what if you don't win? What are the alternatives you are willing to consider? And as an employer, are you willing to sponsor your talent and send them to Canada? As Cristina rightly noted, you can't decide to send someone to Canada on day one and execute it and have them land on day two. It takes some time to carefully prepare, assess their eligibility, understand what their personal background is and what it allows them to do. But let's say things all go well. They've entered Canada in a timeline that works. Unfortunately, the lottery didn't work for them. The question always becomes, what's next? And Cristina rightly noted that Canadian permanent residence in the longer term is an option to many of these employees. their first question tends to be, well, when can I come back to the States? And the answer is, if you want, and if you're supportive as an employer, you can look to bring them back in a year on the L1 visa. Now, the first question I always get when I'm working on an L1 is, okay, when does that start? How does that timeline work? And the answer is, you must spend on payroll 366 days outside of the United States. Meaning you can't say, okay, I'm on Canadian payroll, but I'm spending 5 months in the States this year. Doesn't work that way. It must be outside of the United States during this time. And what Cristina just highlighted is I found in practice, many employees say, you know, I moved to Canada. It was a big move already. I did that once. And I'm just going back to the States to go back on an L1, right? Which, depending on if you're going to manage or not, can be as short as potentially just 5 years. And they say to themselves, I might not even get my green card in 5 years. I might be from a capped out country where it's going to take me, and I just looked this morning, maybe 10 years to get a green card if I'm in an employment-based 2 or 3 category capped out country. But, you know, I'm under 45, I've got an advanced degree, my English is pretty good. I can get Canadian permanent residence in a year or two. I want that foothold, right? I don't want to have to move again. And I've seen repeatedly employees come to their employer and say, hey, you moved me because of losing the H lottery. It happens. I'm making a life in Canada. They're willing to give me permanent residence in a timeline that's acceptable to me. I want to stay. And I think that when we think about, again, short, medium, and long-term benefits of Canada, permanent residence is a major one. In the short term, for you as an employer, all right, we're keeping our best employees doing their best work as seamlessly as possible. Medium term, okay, we've got them at least in Canada for a year. They've committed to us for a year to be here while we work on this L1 eligibility. And then long-term potential of maybe they want to stay in Canada. Maybe they've met someone. Maybe they're interested in just having that foothold so they don't get caught by some very difficult US processing timelines. All these things together say to me, and I hope to you, that Canada can be an excellent alternative to some of the issues that you're seeing in the United States with regards to the visa lottery, keeping young talent and keeping them in the pipeline within the larger organization that you may have, or as Cristina noted, that you may be interested in setting up in Canada as well to keep them supported. All that said, again, the time is now to think about that. If you have any questions about specific employees, we're happy to speak to you on sort of a more one-to-one basis. But that said, I think it makes sense now to open it up to questions. If anybody has some general questions about the lottery, about Canadian work permits and timelines, we can sort of please comment in the chat and we can take it from there.
So Cristina and Benjamin, I actually have a question in my chat, and the question is, we don't have Canadian operations. What do we need to do to start hiring in Canada?
Yeah, that's the question we often get, you know, and it's something that we get now, especially when Canada announced the nomad visa. They say, okay, I can just pop the employee up to Canada, get them, you know, working in Canada, doing what they need to do, and we'll just send them back to the US or get our chances again in the lottery. I caution against that in terms of that might be like an immediate solution if you know that the alternatives in the US are going to kind of iron themselves out in a short while, in a month or two. But the reality is this nomad visa is really just the visitor visa that any person coming to Canada would have to take advantage of. So it's 6 months. And when you're applying for these visas, you'd have to explain to the officer, why do you need to be in Canada for 6 months? The idea is that they're coming into Canada, but then supporting the US operation. That's not a long-term goal. It's really just a band-aid solution, in my opinion. So when finding an alternative to come to Canada, it is about opening up an office. So any of the work permit options that I spoke about, be it the ICT, Francophone, free trade agreements, LMIA applications, it requires a Canadian operation. So that means the company has to be incorporated in Canada. It has to be operational. It has to have a CRA number, payroll, all of that. And that takes time to do. So again, that's another part of the planning process, is getting that operation going in Canada. And then once that's been established, you then can flip the person up to Canada on the different work permits that we've talked about today. So it's important to actually establish the Canadian operation, and how you establish it, is also part of the planning process. So, there's tax implications, there's payroll and employment. So again, that goes to the planning as well. But from a Canadian immigration perspective, it has to be operational. It has to be doing business in Canada.
Great, thank you. And I actually just have one more question in my chat as well. And it's, I have an employee who's been with us for 5 months. Can I transfer them to Canada?
Yeah, I'll give the lawyer answer. It depends. Yes, they likely can if they fall under, as I said, so the ICT is out of the picture because they've only been with you for five months. So the ICT requires 1 year. And as Benjamin alluded to, the L1 and the ICT are essentially mirrors to each other. It's the 1 year on the foreign payroll. So ICT is not an option. So we'd have to either look at maybe a free trade agreement, Francophone, reciprocal, or the LMIA process. If it is an IT role or one of the occupations that is on the GTS list, then we can do the labor market benefit plan. So we eliminate the 4 weeks of advertising altogether. So it's all dependent on what the position is. If we can't use the GTS, then we'd have to do the regular LMIA route, which is the 4 weeks of processing.
And I see there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you guys would like to speak on it.
I can speak on it briefly. The specifics of the employee, I'm happy to talk to you about directly with regards to sort of their immigration history. But the high level question is sort of going in reverse now. We have a Canadian and a US operation, and you have a Canadian employee trying to travel to the United States. Can they go? Can they work? What is the line? And this is something we see all the time, right? Canadians have various sort of jobs or various companies that bring them to the United States. As a Canadian, you have a visa, you don't really realize it, but when you enter the United States on your Canadian passport, you're entering as a visitor. You're entering as what's called a B1, B2 visitor, which allows you to go on vacation, but also allows you to enter as a business visitor. And it seems like if you're, from what I follow in the question, if you're entering as a business visitor, there are very clear tasks you can and cannot do. The line that I always tell clients is, are you entering sort of fulsome? Are you entering the US labor market? By this entry, are you performing something that really an American should be doing? If you're going for meetings further to your job outside of the States, if you're going for training further to your job outside of the States, totally fine reason to enter. If you're going to service something further to your job outside of the States, maybe fix something further to a contract that was made outside, those are all okay at a very high level. But you need to be careful, right? If you're going to perform a job, that's a problem, right? You can't go on US payroll and you can't be performing the job of an American and just getting paid in Canada. So it really depends what you're going to do. Most common travelers are going, again, for meetings or training, and that is 101 in the regulations, totally permissible as a visitor. But in terms of the substance of the work, it would depend whether you need a visa or not. And I know there's some previous TN history there. I'm happy to talk to them about that specific visa one-to-one.
Okay, so that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and a big special thanks to Cristina and Benjamin for sharing their expert knowledge with us. If you'd like to discuss today's topics in more details, or if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out and book a consultation. Details are on the screen right now. I encourage all of you to sign up for our e-alerts and to follow us on social media to keep up to date with the latest developments inside Canadian immigration. Thank you so much for joining, and take care. Bye.